Today, we're taking a little trip back in time to the year 2005 spring semester at Western Michigan University, where this guy was about to give his junior recital made up of all J.J. Johnson tunes. Oof, time. Okay, I got that. I got that chord change. Ugh, my tone is very splattered. I'm trying to get these two fives, I'm just not making every one of them. Like a wide margin. Ouch. Today, we are going to look back at some of the things I was, and in many cases, wasn't practicing while I was in the formative years of developing as an improviser, and how that stuff can help inform what we should be practicing and investing our time on here in the year 2023. What's up, everyone? Thanks for tuning in as always. Today, we are going to talk about 5 different things that sort of my former self has taught my future self or now self about the things we really should be playing. 3 of these will be very musical, and 2 of them will be a little bit more conceptual in nature, but all of them I feel like are very important and things I wish I would have spent more time working on when I was 20, now that I'm very quickly approaching my 40th year. Cool, let's get into it. So our first thing that we are going to talk about, you heard that all over the place in that initial recording, and that is the importance of working on intonation. This is not a very flashy subject, but is something that affects the entirety of our musicianship, and especially for us as trombone players. I can't say that this is a harder instrument to play in tune. All instruments, wind instruments especially, are very difficult to play in tune at a high level. But this is a very easy instrument to play just rancidly out of tune because we have the slide. There's so much variability. So you really need to invest time here and the right type of practice. So I was in music school back in the year 2005. So I was surely thinking about, okay, I've got to pull my Fs out a little bit to make them in tune, pull my Gs in, all that sort of stuff. The thing I wasn't investing time on was practicing with a drone to really train my ears how to hear intonation. Obviously, we got to use a tuner, check where our tuning slide is, all that sort of stuff, check a specific note. But if you really want to train yourself to play in tune more often in general, you really need to work with a drone pitch. There's lots of ways you can create these drones. There are recordings you can buy. Most tuning apps are going to have the ability to create drones. The one I really love is the Tonal Energy app. It allows you to create any number of pitches with a variety of different sounds, and more importantly, it's going to both play the drone and detect your pitch at the same time. And if you're just trying to get this together and you're not really totally sure what to listen for yet, that is indispensable. Ideally, you want to do this all by ear. You want to be listening for pitch, not watching for it. But when you're just getting started to worry about this kind of thing, it's incredibly useful to be like, okay, well, I'm playing this F and I'm playing a G, or the drone is an F, I'm playing a G against it. How do I know what that whole step sounds like? So seeing whether you're in tune or not is really, really useful. The first thing we got to do is just learn how to tune a single note. So say I was working on trying to play my 6 partial Fs a little bit more in tune, my high F. So we know as trombone players, that's a note that we've got to kick out just a little bit to make it in tune. It's going to be a little different on every horn, a little different for every player. So if we use a drone, we can listen for where it is, listen for those little waves in the sound. So I'm going to play it against an F drone. I'm going to start by trying to be as in tune as possible. I'm going to drift out of tune. You'll really hear the difference, and then drift back into tune so you can just hear how that sound quality changes. If that way of thinking is not something you're in tune with, no pun intended, you got to do some practice there to really hear what it is to just play an in-tune unison. From there, you can start to move this into major scales, where I'm going to set a drone, maybe in this case I'm going to do an F, and I'm going to play a major scale against it. Some of the notes are going to sound very in tune and sound easy to tell for, maybe not in tune, but they'll be easy to tell if they're out of tune. For example, the F and the C are very easy to tell. The B flat is relatively easy to tell in this key. But if you're having where the drone is playing an F and you're playing a G, or the drone is playing an F and you're playing an E natural, it's going to be pretty difficult to tell. It takes practice to be able to do this, but it is a muscle that if you invest the time, it'll be a lot stronger. Now, you might have heard there that I actually had more than one pitch going. When I actually do this practice on my own, I like to use the root, the fifth, and then the high root of a given key. So I get sort of this open fifth sound, almost like a power chord. It just gives you a couple more notes of reference to, and also when you do some of these more improvisational exercises that we'll talk about in a second, it's a little more pleasant and appealing to play with. So obviously we've got to be able to play in tune just to be a good instrumentalist. What about for us as improvisers? That's really what we mostly talk about on this channel. We can take some of the sort of foundational music theory things, maybe chords. In this case, we're going to take scales or modes and improvise against these drone pitches with a little bit of focus more on pitch. You know, we're not going to necessarily be trying to play like bebop or fast lines here. I would encourage you to play slower lines so you can hear how some of these chords or some of these notes interact with the drone and hear how some of the different chord colors and scale colors sound like against a drone. We'll start with F Dorian. Now, no promises that I'm perfectly in tune on all this. You know, like I said, it's challenging. I practice this all the time, literally every single day. But still hitting every note just square on right away takes a lot of skill and just constant practice to make sure that muscle is strong. So F Dorian is pretty easy to hear. What if we go to a little trickier scale, something like F diminished dominant, or you might know this as the half whole diminished scale. There's going to be some real crunchy notes when we compare that to this drone in here, but we still got to figure out how to play them as in tune as possible. Cool. Like I said, not super flashy kind of practice. I do think this improvisation stuff can be very useful for getting some of these scales together, but it's more just about fundamental musicianship. Learning to play in tune will, I can't say instantly make you a better musician because it does take time, but once you get a better handle on it, you will notice a distinct difference in the way that you sound if you record yourself and listen back. Being less in tune than I'd like to be is my number one criticism of my own playing when I listen back to recordings of myself. It's always just like, I like the ideas, but I got to play more in tune. So make sure you invest the time here. It really pays good dividends. All right, let's go on to concept number 2 that I wish I would have invested a little bit more time on 20 years ago. That is really learning how to play the blues. Now, when I was in my undergrad, I did practice the blues a ton, but it was mostly about learning how to play the changes on the blues. You know, learning how to hit all the 2/5s, hit the arpeggios, all that sort of stuff. That was certainly important practice. You need to be able to do that. I needed to be able to do that. One area that I did not invest enough time until a little bit later, definitely not until I was into my master's degree, was actually just like playing the blues. Now, this is a lot of things. We might think it's just playing minor pentatonic ideas or playing the blues scale or whatever. That's part of it, is choosing the right type of vocabulary. But it also has to do with your feel, your inflection, your articulation, your sound. All those other things that really make up the blues feel, not just the blues tune. And these things can be a little bit, I don't know, sort of ethereal. Some players really get it easily. Some players struggle a little bit on it. You got to make sure you do the right kind of listening and make it a priority. It'll instantly make your playing, if you can get a handle on this, sound more mature and more authentic. That's kind of step 1 on this stuff, is being able to do it on the blues, on the 12-bar blues. The next step is, can I get that blues sensibility, some of the vocabulary, the feel, the inflection, to work on other tunes that are not blueses? So to start out with, that tune you heard me sounding not so great on the beginning is the J.J. Johnson tune Shortcake. Really fun tune to play on, kind of relatively simple changes, but there's just enough harmony there that it's kind of fun to blow on the tune. Let's check out the first 4 bars of that tune and see what it'd sound like if I try to find that blues sensibility there. To my ear, really, really effective. And I would actually say if you're missing this in your playing is always going to feel sort of deficient in a way. There's lots of different ways to play the blues. But if there's not some connection to that right feel, that right inflection, that right vocabulary, it'll always be just sort of missing something. So don't neglect this, even though it can seem kind of simple or rudimentary. It really will do great things for your playing. On to concept number 3, this is going to be our last one that is very musical in orientation, definitely things you can practice. This is learning how to play over top of the chord changes. As I mentioned, in my undergrad, I was really focused on like, bam, 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 I gotta nail these changes, I gotta hit these thirds and sevenths. Really important skill, that's what a lot of us spend time practicing. The better you get, you start to connect with the fact that, oh, I can kind of group these changes together. And maybe sometimes I actually try to indicate all of them, but sometimes I try to play over top of them and across them in order to help my melodic thinking be a little bit more streamlined. So if we look at the first 4 bars of our tune Shortcake that we're talking about, you'll see it has a D minor 7 to a B flat major 7 to a G minor 7 to an E flat major 7. That's kind of an unconventional chord progression. It's not 2 5s, it's nothing like that. So we've got to figure out what to do on this section of harmony. We could certainly just try to play changes through it, and that could totally be very effective. I know for me, just through kind of learning the tune, analyzing the changes, looking for connections through the changes, I know that I can actually think about this entire 4 bars as D minor, and more specifically, D minor pentatonic. Obviously the first chord is a D minor chord. It's gonna work great there. When we get to the second chord, the B flat major 7 chord, most of the notes that are in D minor pentatonic are actually chord tones in B flat major 7. The D is, the F is, the A natural is. Then you're left with the G and the C. Those are also in the scale of B flat. So it's going to sound great on that chord. It's really not going to sound outside at all. It's going to sound very, very inside, but it's going to help you to sort of keep your ideas flowing over those 2 bars. If we keep going forward, G minor, that's very, very closely related to D minor. Actually, one of the good ways you can use a pentatonic scale on a minor chord is to build off of the 5th of that minor chord. It's going to just give you a slightly less resolved sound, but it's still going to sound great. The one that's maybe a little bit of a stretch is on that E flat major 7 chord that we end with. If we think about the chord zones of E flat major 7, it's an E flat, a G, a B flat, and a D. Now, in the D minor pentatonic, we do have a D, we do have a G, and so those are chord tones. But that B flat is not in there. In the minor pentatonic scale, we have an A natural, which is not strictly in E flat. And so some of these other notes that are in the D minor pentatonic are not as strongly related to E flat major. And so we're going to be implying sharp 11 sounds if we use the minor pentatonic, a little more tension in this, but that is going to sound great. We're going to be sort of moving in this phrase, at the beginning of the phrase, where we're on D minor, that's going to be a little more inside, and then we gradually move to being a little less inside throughout the phrase. That can be really cool and can lead us to some nice ideas. Then that little example I just played, it was bam, right back to hitting the changes when I got to E minor 7 flat 5. That is the trick with this. How can I sort of think across the changes for a chunk, drift back to the changes in key places? That can create very satisfying melodies that are not so maybe like bound up in like I gotta get to every single change in every measure. That can kind of tie you a knot sometimes, and having alternate approaches is very helpful. Now on to our final 2 things, which are a little more conceptual in nature. These are not necessarily things you could just like practice as an exercise. They're going to affect the entirety of your playing. I'm going to try to move through these at least relatively quickly. I could probably talk an entire lesson about each one of these because they are very important. The first thing that you got to think about, and that I wish I would have spent more time on when I was 18, 19, 20 years old, is gaining a better level of mastery on easier material. So when I was in music school, I wasted an immense amount of time practicing Moment's Notice. Now, it's not that this is a bad tune. This is a great tune. This is a tune you should learn, you should practice, but it is a very challenging tune. And when I was in my undergrad, I was nowhere near ready to play this song. As we heard from me playing on Shortcake there, I was struggling just to navigate through some relatively basic 2/5s working in very conventional ways at a medium tempo. Moment's Notice is almost always played fast. It has a lot of 2/5s in a lot of different keys, and they move in very unconventional ways. And so me trying to work on that tune, it was just, the cart was so far before the horse that I just really couldn't even function on it. The question might be, well, why does this happen? Music school has certain pressures. Obviously, there are my peers. I can tell you that when I was in my undergrad, I was quite a bit, I'll say, behind my peers as an improviser. I grew up in a very rural part of the country. There was not a lot of jazz, so I didn't necessarily get a ton of jazz instruction when I was in high school. So I went to college really being behind where I should have been. So there was a lot of catching up I had to do. And so I just wasn't ready to play that tune where maybe some of my peers would have been. In addition, if you go to music school, you're going to have most likely an end of semester jury where you're going to have to play something. At the school where I went to, there was a list of tunes that, you had to have all those prepared. They would call several of the tunes and you had to be able to play the melodies, improvise on them, sound good. Moment's Notice was on that list for sure. Probably in the junior year, maybe the end of the sophomore even possibly. I can't quite remember. But for me, it was just too difficult at that time. I would have much rather maybe see now in retrospect that the jazz juries at any school, and this is only my 2 cents, so you can take it for what it is, would maybe be more developed between the student and the teacher. What is the expectation to work on this semester? There should be standards that we measure students against to make sure they're progressing, but it should be much more holistic just because students are in widely different places, even if we're at the same year of school. And so maybe it would be something where me, the teacher, and the student, we develop what the sort of parameters are for that year, and then they're assessed at the end of the semester of whether they were able to meet those parameters in a good way. So all this is just to say that you really got to find the right balance of finding real mastery over material. That's what I've learned as an older musician and especially as an educator. Students achieve by being able to play stuff really, really well, not by just like hanging on, by their fingernails to something they can barely play. And a lot of times in music education or wherever, that is sort of the paradigm we get into. So be careful that you don't sort of get like pushed along to harder and harder tunes, especially in the modern world. The things you see online, on social media, or whatever, that is a lot of times going to seem like, oh, I got to practice these hard tunes, these difficult concepts. Well, you really got to have command over the foundations and then move from there. That will make those more difficult tunes easier when you get there and you will sound better on them. So don't underinvest in foundational concepts and easier tunes, the blues, simple song structures, all that type of stuff. All right, the final thing. Hopefully you've stuck with me this far. This one is incredibly important, something I did not learn probably until very recently, maybe in the last 5 or 6 years. That is how to be a performer. This means a lot of different things in a lot of different styles. For us as jazz musicians, yes, it has to do with all the music we play, the music we pick, the way we practice it, how good we sound, but it also is how do we talk to the audience? How do we carry ourselves on stage? How do we dress? How do we conceptualize a show? These things really matter to whether the music that we're creating connects to the listener in some way. For me, there were 2 key things that really helped me develop a better relationship and understanding about how to be a performer. The first was dealing with performance anxiety. I've talked about this before on the channel. I'll try to remember to throw a little card up so you could click on the link if you so desire to see that video. For most of my earlier part of my career, definitely from when I was in high school on into my early to mid 30s, I was dealing with a significant amount of performance anxiety, but I didn't realize that's what was going on. I just thought I sucked, in all honesty, because I would practice and sound okay, but then when it got time to performance, my level would just fall off a cliff. I'm very sure that is what happened to me on my junior recital that we heard the little clip of. I'm very sure in the practice room I was feeling relatively confident because I'm a studious practicer, but I know as soon as I got on that stage, my mind just was like, left me because there was so much anxiety over performing. So about maybe 8 years ago or so, this would have been maybe in 2014, 2015, 2016, sometime in there, I realized that this was affecting my performance in a huge way. And so I actually got serious and I went to some therapy for it. Now, it only took a handful of sessions with my counselor to kind of unpack and figure out what I needed to do, but then it did take an additional 1.5 to 2 years of doing that work. I started to notice improvement after about 6 months of doing it, but it took a while after that before it really started to feel like, oh, I feel pretty comfortable on stage now. This has truly been one of the best decisions for me, not just as a performer, but just for me as a human. So if it's something you can take advantage of, maybe seeking out a little bit of, mental health professional help about this stuff, it can really aid your performance. If you can't access that, at least do some research online. You'd be surprised to find there's a lot of resources, a lot of strategies you can find, and a lot of times even just understanding that many musicians deal with this is very helpful. It can feel sort of like, you can feel like I felt, where I was just like, oh, I just suck. I shouldn't get nervous. That's not something that a real performer does, but it is not true. Many performers get nervous, and it's just learning some strategies to work through this to help you perform better. The second thing that has helped me improve as a performer as I've gotten a little bit older is just understanding about who I was on stage. Now, this comes from the music I choose, just me understanding my voice as a musician a little bit better, but it also has a lot to do with understanding how I want to relate to the audience. You need to take some time to figure out, like, what version of yourself does the audience actually want to connect with? It's very likely that the version that's on a Tuesday afternoon practicing 2-5-1s is really not an aspect that they're incredibly interested in. Maybe other musicians want to hear like your stuff, but most audience members are not really so interested in that. So you've got to figure out what that is. How do you do that? For some people, it just comes naturally, and those people just are natural performers and it works. For many other people, you got to give it some thought. You got to kind of feel it out to see like, well, how can I conduct myself on stage that feels natural? You don't want it to be a put on or sort of pandering to the audience. They're very sensitive to that, and they probably will not go along with you if they sort of sense that you're being fake on stage. You've got to figure out the authentic version that is interesting to them. The key for me has been to connect with that I love performances that have a little more casual feel. Now, I don't mean casual in that I'm like wearing sweatpants on stage or something like that, or that we're just sort of like randomly calling tunes. If you go to a Sean Bell show, there's going to be a set list. I'm going to be looking appropriate. The band is going to be prepared. So in that way, it's very professional. It's more in the way I relate to the audience. I hate feeling like I'm on stage, the audience is in the audience, and there's a wall between us. No, we're all in this together. We're having a musical moment together. So when I talk to the audience, I make sure I'm talking to them. I keep it relatively casual. Maybe a mistake happens on stage, or like, some sort of little funny thing happens on stage. I don't like try to hide from that and be like, oh my gosh, this performance is going bad because there was a mistake. No, maybe I just acknowledge it and move on, or maybe even make light of it. It's all about how do you connect with the audience so that way they're going to be engaged in the music that you want to make. As instrumentalists, we don't have as many tools as a vocalist does, for example, to draw the audience in. So we've got to use everything at our disposal to do that. So what you do as a performer, a lot of times is going to be the determining factor about whether your music actually gets listened to, or if it's just sort of like a gig. And to me, I want the audience to connect with my music and have more than just like, oh, well, I went to see this band at a show and it was fine. Cool. That's all I got for today. Clearly, hindsight is 2020, and any of us who are more experienced musicians can look back at what we were doing, 5, 10, 20 years ago, be like, I maybe should have done some of that differently. But hopefully some of these things that I've noticed about my own journey can help you on your journey too. Cool. We'll see you in the woodshed.